find you.
Okay, no problem. Good evening. Good evening. Okay, good. That's good. Okay, well, we want to welcome everybody here tonight. Nick is going to be teaching our class. We're talking about the kingdom again, right? Okay, the permanent kingdom. All right. Very good. I'm excited to hear about that. 490 will be the first song this evening. I'll also lead a song toward the end. Is that the one we had first? Yeah. Okay. I thought that's what I put first.
I did it the order you texted me.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very much. One of my favorites. I don't know if that's true for any of you, but there's a whole background to this song that's really fascinating, but we don't have time to talk about it right now. There's a story behind the song, the hymn, yes. Well, it's a story about this man who lost family. They wrote this song. It's a tragic situation. But he had peace with God. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. My sin, all the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin not in part, but the whole is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend, even so. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
Thank you, Everett. Give me a second to move this microphone. I'll leave it up here because we'll need it at the end. Hopefully that doesn't obstruct anyone's views. Thanks for being here, everybody. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire is something that has been studied for a long time. In fact, it's been studied for centuries. The Roman Empire is regarded as one of the most powerful and most influential empires that our world has ever seen. At its height, there really wasn't an empire that compared to the Roman Empire. They were strong, they were powerful, and they were mighty. And for centuries, the Roman Empire dominated the world. Well, how then could such a dominating empire fall? How could what some call the empire of all empires, how could that just cease to exist? Well, when you study the history of the Roman Empire, there were a lot of factors that led to its demise. There was a lot of division and civil wars. There was greed and corruption. There was backstabbing and betrayal. Some would say that Rome got a little too big for their britches. Interestingly enough, some look at the United States of America and they see some of the same fractures and issues that perhaps played a role in the fall of the Roman Empire. America is, as I'm sure you know, incredibly divided. You also probably are aware of the fact that our leaders are immoral and corrupt. Faith in institutions is crippling. These all seem to point to an impending implosion. The warning signs are certainly there. This is a look at some of the largest empires to have ever existed, just in terms of geographic size. I have here 5 empires. This isn't the top 5, but it's 5 that we are probably decently familiar with, some of which come from more recent history. And it has the size in square miles. Notice all of them are in the millions. And then it has the percentage of the world that this empire would have taken up at the time. And so the British Empire, which peaked in the year 1920, at that point had a size of over almost 14 million square miles, taking up over 26% of the world. The British Empire was quite large. And this is fairly recent, 1920. Then you have the Mongol Empire, whose peak was sometime in the 13th and 14th centuries. It stretched, this is over Asia is where this would have been. It stretched from the Sea of Japan into Eastern Europe, and its peak size was over 9 million square miles, or almost 18% of the world. And you go on down, you have the Russian Empire making up 8.8 million square miles. Its peak was in 1895. The Russian Empire would eventually get succeeded by the Soviet Union, which was almost as large. The Soviet Union was, I think, 8.6 million square miles in size. Then you have the Spanish Empire, which its peak was in 1810, and it got as big as almost 5.5 million square miles. And then the Roman Empire, which we regard as pretty high and mighty, was pretty small compared to some of these. Just under 2 million square miles, about 3.71% of the world's landmass back then. And these are all estimates. So one question when you look at these empires is, what do these former kingdoms have in common? It's the fact that they are former kingdoms. That's one thing that they all have in common. They are each big, they each were dominating, and so on and so forth, but they are former kingdoms. These kingdoms did not last forever, as great as they may have been. And you could say the same thing, you could say the same thing about today's kingdoms, that they, like the kingdoms of the past, are only temporary. In 100 years from now, who knows what nations will still be around us? Who knows if America will still be around? It is not guaranteed because they are only temporary. Do you know why they're temporary? The reason is because the earth and the things of the earth are only temporary. Notice this that John writes in 1 John chapter 2, starting in verse 15. He says, "Don't love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." Something interesting that John does when you read all of his writings, both in his gospel account and also his letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he uses the word interchangeably to refer to a few different things. For example, in John 3:16, he says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The world there refers to the entirety of humanity in all of its existence. But the world, as he uses it in 1 John 2, refers to the desires of the flesh. That is what is in the world. And so in that sense, the world is contrasted with that which is spiritual. You have that which is physical contrasted to that which is spiritual. And so you see here how John is using this. He goes on to say, of course, that the world is passing away along with its desires. This is referring to that which is fleshly compared to that which is spiritual. It is passing away. We also know that the physical world around us is also passing away. We hear that every day with people who are obsessed with the climate change and all of that. And perhaps it is. I'm not going to deny that. But the world is passing away, and that is the reason why the things of this world are temporary. The kingdoms of this world are temporary because the world itself is temporary. Look at this in Isaiah chapter 40. I hope that's big enough to where you can read it. This is Isaiah 40, starting in verse 6. A voice says, "Cry." And I said, "What shall I cry?" All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Repeatedly here we see attention toward the fact that the things of this earth, here the prophet describes as the grass and then the flower of the field. We see it repeatedly here that these things are temporary. The grass withers and then the flowers fade. And yet here in this passage, we see that they're compared to flesh, to humanity, to us. Well, here lies the problem. Humanity is temporary just as the world is temporary. The kingdoms of earth are temporary because the earth and the people of the earth are temporary. One thing that's interesting when you think about the kingdoms of the past and even modern day kingdoms, empires, nations, so on and so forth, is they have a sort of head of state, a president, a prime minister, whatever you might want to think about. Well, they're just a person. Eventually, they will not be here anymore. And what's going to happen to the nation when that person goes away? What will happen to the United States when we have a new president at the beginning of next year? Well, there's a lot of discussion about that, depending on who gets put in and so on. What will happen if, say, Russia gets a new head of state? If Vladimir Putin steps away or something happens to him, what would happen to Russia? We don't know. We don't know what that would hold because Vladimir Putin has been in power for so long, it seems. The leaders are people. And the leaders are temporary, just as their kingdoms are temporary, just as the world itself is temporary. But we see that God's kingdom, which is the theme of what we've been discussing here this week during Reach Week, God's kingdom is not of this world. One of my favorite passages is this exchange that Jesus has in John chapter 18, where Jesus answers and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of, or not from, this world." And so we see Jesus here talking about this kingdom. He's not denying the fact that he's a king, nor is he denying that he has a kingdom. But what he's saying is that his kingdom is not of this world. This is not a physical kingdom. It's a spiritual one. If his kingdom was of this world, he'd have his subjects fighting on his behalf, as he says. His servants would be fighting. But his kingdom is not of this world. It's of the world that is to come. And so we see that God's kingdom is eternal, which stands in a large contrast to the kingdoms of the earth. We've seen them rise and fall over the years, and they will continue to rise and fall as time goes on. But God's kingdom is eternal. God's kingdom has risen up, and it will never fall. Consider this from Daniel chapter 2. This was our scripture reading on Sunday morning. And in the days of those kings, this is in the midst of a vision that the king of Babylon was having. He says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. In other words, it's not as if Assyria is going to come and take over Israel, and then Babylon takes over Assyria, and then Greece takes over Babylon, and then Persia takes over Greece. It's not like that. That's not how it's going to be. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. We see that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, and we understand that that kingdom has been set up. Because it's been set up, it will never be destroyed, and it will stand forever, no matter who might be against it, no matter what forces may be against it. It will stand forever. Later in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, this is the point where Daniel's prophecy turns from more narrative storytelling, right? You have the stories, say, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You have the story of Daniel in the lion's den. But in chapter 7, it shifts. It shifts to more prophetic, and it shifts, in particular, it shifts more apocalyptic in nature. And we see in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. That's a title that Jesus uses very frequently of himself. We'll see that in our Sunday morning class when we go through the Gospel of Matthew. There came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And so Daniel is showing us this vision that he's having, and there is this Son of Man who comes before this Ancient of Days person. He goes on to say, to him, that him there is the Son of Man, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Notice that there is this Son of Man, and he's given this dominion and this glory. He's given this ruling power, and he's given a kingdom which he will rule over. And we see that his dominion is everlasting. It will not end. It will not pass on to someone else. And his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. It doesn't matter what forces come against it. It doesn't matter what army comes. It will stand forever, and it will not be destroyed. Consider the promise that God gave to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is a promise that the Jews were very familiar with. This is a promise that they looked for, and this is a promise that we understand Jesus ultimately fulfilled. God tells David in 2 Samuel 7, starting in verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring, or your seed after you, who shall come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. There's this one who's coming from the seed of David, the offspring of David. And it's interesting because we understand that Solomon partially fulfills this prophecy, because Solomon is, of course, David's son. He does, of course, take the throne, and he does, of course, build the house of God, the temple. That's perhaps an initial fulfillment of this prophecy, but there is an eternal fulfillment as well. And that eternal fulfillment is Jesus. And we know that because Solomon didn't last on the throne forever. He reigned for about 40 years, and then he died, and then his son took his place, and his son kind of made a mess of things, which led to the division of the kingdom and all of that. But we know that Solomon isn't the ultimate fulfillment of this. There's one coming who would be. And the Jews knew this. They were looking for this Son of David figure who would come and who would rule forever, who would reestablish the kingdom of Israel as they understood it. And we know that this, of course, is Jesus. And God goes on to tell David in verse 16 of that chapter, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. Jesus fulfills this. Jesus is the eternal king. His kingdom is forever. His throne endures. Consider this also from Matthew chapter 16. This is a great chapter. It's a great chapter because it seems, if you're reading this for the first time, it seems as if Peter, the one who's been so outspoken among the others, the one who perhaps speaks a little too soon, needs a little more time to think, he finally seems to get it right. Jesus is asking his disciples, well, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? And they say Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the other prophets. And then he says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter rises up among the others and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there's this great moment that Peter has with Jesus. And Jesus tells him, you're Peter now. He was Simon, now he's Peter. He is the rock. That's what the word Peter means, or the name Peter. He says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Notice, by the way, that it's one church. It's singular. And he says, the gates of hell or Hades shall not prevail against it. Not even the gates of hell will prevail against this church. And we understand that the church is the kingdom. Not even the gates of hell will prevail against Jesus' church and against Jesus' kingdom. We have this great message in Hebrews chapter 12, where the writer says, therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. He says here that we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The context of this is very interesting in Hebrews chapter 12. The Hebrew writer is talking about how God will remove that which can be shaken. In other words, he's going to bring the temporary things to an end. That's what he says in verses 25 through 27. Those things that can be shaken, the temporary, the earthly things, such as the kingdoms of the earth, they will be removed. But that which cannot be shaken, the eternal things, like the kingdom of God, these things will remain. And so we have received a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And the reason for that, the reason that God's kingdom is permanent or that it is eternal is because God himself is eternal. Contrast this with the kingdoms of the earth. The earth is temporary, the kingdoms are temporary, the monarchs over those kingdoms are all temporary. They all die one way or another, but not with God's kingdom. God's kingdom is eternal because God himself is eternal. There's a lot of great verses you could turn to in looking at the permanence of God. I guess that's a word. Go back to Isaiah 40, where the prophet says, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Isaiah makes it plain here in this oracle that the Lord, Jehovah, is the everlasting God. To be everlasting means he's the beginning and the end. He stretches across all time. And the only God that we could say that of is Jehovah. The Lord is the everlasting God. He is the creator. He's the creator of all things, the author of life itself. And he does not faint or grow weary. He doesn't get tired. Imagine that, huh? Not getting tired, not growing faint or growing weary. And we know from this that his understanding is unsearchable. Consider this also from Psalm 90. This is supposedly a psalm of Moses. And it says in verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, before things were created, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Think about Genesis 1 and verse 1, very first words of our Bible. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. He's there. We understand that he has always been there. He exists outside of time. God created time. He is eternal. And so we see, with regards to the permanent kingdom, that the kingdoms of earth are temporary because the earth itself is temporary. We understand that the earth is more or less a ticking time bomb. That's how scientists understand it. Eventually the earth will be destroyed, and the Bible even tells us that. We read in places about how the earth will be burned up at the end and so on. The earth is temporary, and we understand that the people of the earth are also temporary. Leaders rise up and they come down. But we see that God's kingdom is eternal because God is eternal. So what does this mean for us? How do we respond in light of such a kingdom? You may remember in years past, recently, when a certain political leader, and it's been true of multiple, so when a leader gets put into office and people threaten to leave and go to another country because they don't like how things are in their nation, in their part of the world. Well, there's a greater kingdom that we can all be a part of, the permanent kingdom that belongs to God. So how do we respond to this in light of the fact that there is an eternal kingdom out there and there is an eternal king? CJ spent a lot of time in Matthew chapter 6 yesterday, and he was cramping my style, not just because of this class, but because of my Matthew class. I like to give him a hard time, especially because he's not here. I know he's listening. But in Matthew 6, there's a lot in terms of how people of the kingdom are to act. And that was the point of CJ's lesson. In light of the kingdom, how do we live our life? Well, the whole Sermon on the Mount gives us a great picture, but I want to focus a little bit on what we read in Matthew chapter 6. It says, starting in verse 19, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." We see here a call to action from Jesus. There's something for us not to do, and then there's something for us to do. He starts by saying, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. And the reason why is, again, because it's all temporary. These treasures on earth that we can lay up, things like money, wealth, possessions, good favor even from other people, these are all temporary things. As Jesus puts it, moth and rust destroy. Thieves break in and steal. These things will not endure forever. They won't endure the test of time. An expression that I hear people say is, you can't bring those things with you to heaven, no matter what it may be. And I know we have things that are precious to us. Some of it may be for sentimental reasons. Some of it may be because of the sheer value of some of these things. But that's not where we are to lay up our treasures. That's not where all of our attention needs to be. Instead, Jesus says to lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The things that you cherish the most, are they earthly things or are they heavenly things? The things that you treasure the most, are they temporary things or are they eternal things? The things that you treasure the most, can moth and rust destroy them? Can thieves steal them? Or is it guarded for us in heaven? Jesus calls us to lay up our treasures in heaven, spiritual things. And the reason is because these treasures are eternal. Moth and rust cannot destroy these things. Thieves cannot break in and steal these things. And he gives a great application in verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The things you treasure, those are the things that matter the most to you. That's where your heart is. So where are our hearts? Are they on that which is temporary? Or are they on that which is eternal, that which is permanent? Are we thinking about the temporary kingdoms, or are we thinking about the permanent, godly kingdom? Later in this chapter, Jesus shifts the focus from that which we treasure to that which we need to live, to keep going through this life. He says in verse 25, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on it. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" These are things that we need, aren't they? These are things to sustain us through this physical life that we find ourselves in. We can't survive without food. We can't survive without water, things to drink. And unless we want to be menaces to society, we need clothes to wear, don't we? He goes on to say, don't be anxious about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll put on. I've known many people who have had a great deal of anxiety over these things, living paycheck to paycheck, worrying, am I going to have enough money to put food on the table for my family? Am I going to have enough money to buy clothes for my kids? That is obviously a great source of anxiety for a lot of people. But Jesus tells us to not be anxious about these things because He will provide them for us. God will provide for His children. He goes on to say here, is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? And I love how this ends. But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. What He's not saying is totally disregard what you eat and what you drink. That's not what He's saying. He's saying don't be anxious over those things. Don't seek those things first. Instead, seek God's kingdom first. And the reason why is because God's kingdom is eternal. His righteousness is eternal. It will transform our lives when we do that. And when we do that, those things that we worry about, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the water, or the things that we drink, He says all of these things will be added to you. That's a promise that Jesus gives us in His kingdom, which is a foreshadowing of tomorrow night's class, but promises from the kingdom. I also love this from Hebrews 12. We looked at this earlier in regards to the kingdom that cannot be shaken. Well, it's interesting because the Hebrew writer here not only tells us that we've received a kingdom that cannot be shaken, but he tells us what we need to do about it. How do we respond to receiving this kingdom? He starts by saying, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Many people take it for granted that we have this kingdom and that we have the king that we have. Many people take that for granted. People oftentimes forget about that fact, that we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken and that we have a king who reigns and rules in eternity. But the Hebrew writer says we need to be grateful for this fact, that we have received a kingdom that cannot be shaken, a kingdom that will never be overthrown. There's a lot of people across our world that are worried about if their nation will survive. You have the people in Ukraine. Is Russia going to overpower them? Is Russia going to win that war and take over? Perhaps have people in Russia worried about it as well. You have people in the nation of Taiwan worried. People in Israel are worried. People in Iran are worried. You have people, even people in America can be worried about this. Is our nation going to last? You don't have to worry about that with God's kingdom. Our king cannot be assassinated. He cannot be overthrown. And our kingdom cannot be destroyed. So he says, let us be grateful for this fact that we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And then he says, let's offer to God acceptable worship, doing so with reverence and with awe. When God does something for us, the appropriate response is, I think, perfectly outlined here by the Hebrew writer. One, be grateful for it. But then two, offer something to God. And I know comparatively we can't give much to God that He doesn't already have. But one thing we can offer is acceptable worship. Worship the way that He wants us to do so. And so we offer this acceptable worship. But it's not just the worship we offer, it's how we offer it. What's our mindset as we offer it? He says to do so with reverence and with awe. To have that reverence is to have a sense of seriousness to it. To take it seriously, to not take it lightly. And to do so with awe is to do so in light of knowing how powerful God truly is and how small we are in comparison. Doing so with reverence and with awe is often neglected, Even in churches of Christ, it's often neglected. You have some people sometimes who are up leading worship in whatever capacity that is, whether it's prayers or song leading or even preaching. And you may sometimes notice a lack of reverence. But it's not even with the leaders, it's with the participants, people sitting in these pews. Do we have the reverence that we're called to have when it comes to our acceptable worship? And is our worship acceptable if it's not with reverence and awe? I would argue that it's not. We need that reverence and we need that awe in our worship. That is how we respond to this kingdom, this eternal, this permanent kingdom. We show our gratitude for it. We worship God, our King, for it. That's all I have tonight. What comments or questions do you have? Everett?
It's talking about the storing up things on earth versus the heavenly treasures. I heard something today on the radio. Kobe Bryant's locker was up on auction. Did you hear this?
Yeah, it sold for $2 or something.
$2.9 million.
Yeah.
To buy his locker. His locker was in a certain place they played from like 2003 to 2016 or something. And I thought, wow. I mean, that person obviously had the wherewithal to be able to do that. What could you do, though, in terms of good with $2.9 million?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know. Just an interesting situation, for sure.
Everett was
Drawing on the idea from what Jesus said about laying up treasures on earth versus in heaven. And I saw it too. Kobe Bryant, if you don't know who he is, he was a basketball player. He's deceased now. And it's perhaps why his locker sold for so much money, is his locker from when he played sold for almost $3 million. I saw another thing from when he played his last game in 2016. Someone tried to auction off on eBay a bag of air from that game, and they put like tens of thousands of dollars on it or something crazy like that. If someone's willing to pay that kind of money for something like that, and I understand that's a pretty memorable thing to have, Kobe Bryant's locker. Think about how valuable that is, and think how much more valuable is what we have with the kingdom. And think about if someone valued God's kingdom as much as they valued that locker with that kind of money. That's just, for one, it's unfathomable to think about having that kind of money to put towards something like that. But it's another thing to value something that much. Think about how much more valuable our kingdom is. Anything else? Jim?
The point that you made from the Hebrews, that there's so many things that are shaken and they crumble. And yet so many of these things, we put so much interest in them, and concern, and money and all of these things. But yet there's a kingdom that will not be shaken. And sometimes we minimize that and don't give it the gratitude that we should. And then the worship with reverence, because it's a kingdom that is not going to be shaken or taken away. It's just an amazing thought. I'm really glad you brought that up.
something that you just made me think about is,
when we have something and it's stable, we take that for granted so often. You have a stable vehicle for all these years. All of a sudden it starts going bad because it gets old, and you haven't had that worry for the last 6-8 years. Now all of a sudden, boom, your vehicle starts going bad. And yeah, our health. Thinking of in sports, you have a coach who's around for so long, and then he retires or he goes and leaves, and all of a sudden the program is in disarray, right? You take for granted those good coaches that you have. Think about yesterday, the stock market crashed big time. And a lot of people are worried about that. Didn't it drop like 1,000 points or something crazy like that? Yeah. And so you have a lot of people worried about that. You see our society kind of crumbling a little bit. Compare that to our kingdom, which is eternal.
Can be concerned about, but first is the kingdom, and while we can be concerned about them, we have this great kingdom that sometimes we're not even concerned about and take for granted.
right. Anything else?
Everett has one more song for us, and then Jim will wrap us up with some announcements. Thanks again for being here, and thanks for your attention.